The circus tent reeked of old straw, diesel, and something darker: fear. It was the kind of smell that clung to your skin, followed you home, and whispered that something was terribly wrong. The spotlight had gone out hours ago, but behind the torn canvas curtain, the cages were still humming with breath. Low, ragged, tired breath. In the farthest corner, under a moldy tarp, lay a crate that barely held its shape. Inside, a pair of amber eyes stared into the dark. He was only a few weeks old, ribs showing through his patchy golden coat. His front paw bled from where he'd tried, again, to dig through the wire floor. His tiny body trembled, not from cold, but from something far more dangerous: confusion. The cub didn't know where his mother was. He didn't know why he couldn't stretch, or why the shadows around him screamed at night. When the rescue team arrived, they weren't looking for him. It was part of a larger operation, a sting to shut down a traveling circus accused of illegal animal trafficking. They found bears chained to walls, monkeys drugged and dressed in glitter, a tiger so thin her bones made sounds when she moved. And then, in silence, one of the rescuers, a teenager no older than 17, lifted the corner of the tarp. And there he was, a lion cub, filthy, fragile, forgotten. The boy froze, not out of fear, out of something else. Recognition, maybe. A feeling that this small creature, so full of suffering, had somehow waited just for him. The cub didn't roar. He didn't back away. He didn't blink. He just looked. That stare cut through the noise, through the chaos, and into something sacred. The team leader shouted, "Let's move! We've got what we need!" But the boy didn't hear him. He knelt by the cage, eyes locked with the lion's, and whispered something he wouldn't remember later. Something soft and stupid like, "Hey, buddy." And then the cub made a sound. Not a growl, not a whimper, but a low, crumpled hum, like the sound of air escaping a broken balloon. It was the first noise he'd made in days, and it was enough. "Take this one too," the boy said. "Please." The crate was rusted shut. They had to cut the wires with bolt cutters, careful not to scrape his skin. When the door finally creaked open, the cub didn't run. He didn't flinch. He simply stepped forward, slow, deliberate, and leaned against the boy's chest. He was all bones and dirt and fleas. But the way he rested there, like he belonged, turned the moment into something holy. One of the rescuers chuckled. "Looks like you've got yourself a shadow." The boy didn't smile. He just wrapped the cub in his jacket and carried him to the van like he was made of glass. As the circus shrank in the rearview mirror, the lion cub didn't look back. He just curled into the warmth of his new world, the heartbeat, the cotton, the safety, and slept. And in that sleep, something began to heal. They named him Moyo. It meant heart in Swahili, the name chosen not by a committee or a vet, but whispered by the boy himself during one of their first quiet mornings together. It fit somehow. This lion wasn't just flesh and fur, he was feeling, and his heart beat louder than most. The wildlife center was small, tucked behind rolling hills and sunburnt grasslands, far from the city's noise. It wasn't glamorous. Corrugated metal roofs, muddy footpaths, and feeding schedules scribbled on clipboards. But for Moyo, it was paradise compared to where he'd come from. And for the boy, Daniel, it was more than a volunteer job. It was an escape. Daniel had stumbled into the rescue world by accident. After his father left, the silence at home became too loud. His mother worked late, the fridge buzzed like a lonely metronome, and nights stretched long with questions he didn't want to answer. The center had been a way to fill time, but then he met Moyo, and time stopped feeling empty. Every morning, before the sun had fully opened its eyes, Daniel would be there. Moyo would already be pacing in his pen, eyes lit with anticipation. He never roared, not for food, not for attention, just waited, listened. And when Daniel arrived, he'd press his nose between the slats of the wooden gate and let out that same low hum from the night they met. Their routine became sacred. Daniel would sit cross-legged on the dirt, milk bottle in hand, while Moyo lapped at it with greedy little gulps, often leaving his chin a dripping mess. Afterward, they'd walk. Not far, just a few cautious circles in the enclosed yard, Daniel's hand brushing Moyo's back as if guiding a sleepy toddler. The cub would swat at butterflies, trip over his own paws, and occasionally collapse dramatically under the nearest patch of shade. They didn't speak, of course, but silence between them never felt empty. Sometimes Daniel would lie back and tell Moyo things he never told anyone else. About the time he found his dad's note, about the ache in his mother's eyes, about the guilt he carried, though he had no idea why. And Moyo, always still, always listening, would nudge his head against Daniel's side as if to say, "You can rest now." The staff noticed. "He's too attached," the vet warned. "It's dangerous." But Daniel couldn't help it. Neither could Moyo. One day, a senior rescuer pointed to the lion and said, "He's imprinting on you. You're becoming his world. That's not always good." Daniel understood the science. But science didn't explain the way Moyo's eyes followed him across the yard, or how he refused to eat when Daniel was gone, or the way he trembled during thunderstorms, until Daniel came and simply sat with him, hand resting on his back, both of them waiting for the shaking to stop. There was one afternoon, heavy clouds, thick silence, when Daniel arrived late. Moyo was agitated, pacing erratically, bumping into his enclosure walls. The moment Daniel stepped through the gate, the lion cub sprinted toward him, slammed into his legs, and collapsed in a heap of panting relief. Daniel knelt, arms wrapped around him. And that was when the staff finally said what no one wanted to say: "We need to start preparing for separation." Daniel's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "Moyo's growing fast. He can't stay here forever. He'll need space, freedom, a real sanctuary. You know that." He did know, but knowing didn't make it hurt less. That night, Daniel didn't sleep. He sat outside Moyo's enclosure under a flickering lamp, watching the cub dream. His paws twitched, whiskers fluttered, maybe chasing something in the tall grass of a place he'd never seen. Daniel leaned his head against the gate, eyes burning. He couldn't say it yet, but somewhere deep down, he knew. This wasn't just a phase. This wasn't just about healing. He loved this animal, and he wasn't ready to let go. The mornings became rituals, slow, sacred, and stitched together by habit and heart. By now, Moyo had grown. No longer the trembling scrap of fur rescued from a circus cage, he was heavier, stronger, his golden coat thickening with each sunrise. But even as his body changed, something inside him stayed the same. He still waited. Each day, just before the sky turned pink, Moyo would rise and pad to the wooden gate of his enclosure, ears twitching, nose lifting to the breeze. There was no clock, no schedule, only instinct, only the memory of footsteps in gravel, the sound of a boy's breath behind wire, the certainty that Daniel would come. And Daniel always did. He'd arrive in his same faded hoodie, boots still muddy from the last shift. His eyes were always tired, school, chores, late-night texts that went unanswered. But the moment he saw Moyo, they lit up. "Hey, big guy," he'd whisper, voice still caught in the fog of sleep. Moyo would hum back, a sound that started in his chest and rolled into the air like a low purr mixed with memory. Daniel would unhook the latch, slip inside the pen, and sit beside him. No fear, no hesitation, just presence. Breakfast came next. Moyo had graduated from milk bottles to slabs of raw meat, but some days he still nuzzled at Daniel's pockets like he expected warm milk to appear. Daniel would laugh and say, "Not anymore, sorry. You're all grown up now." But Moyo didn't seem to believe it. After feeding, they walked. The enclosure was larger now, set near a patch of acacia trees, with long grass and scattered stones. But Moyo rarely wandered far. He stayed close, always within a few strides of the boy who had once carried him like a baby. Sometimes they ran. Daniel would sprint ahead, calling Moyo's name, and the lion would thunder after him with terrifying speed, only to stop just short, flop to the ground, and roll onto his back, paws in the air like a puppy begging for belly scratches. Other mornings, they just lay in the grass, side by side, watching clouds move. A hawk would circle overhead. The wind would rustle the trees, and the world, just for a while, would feel like it had no sharp edges. But time never stops, even when it's beautiful. Moyo's teeth were sharper now. His roars, once tiny hiccups of sound, had turned into thunder that rolled through the valley. The staff had started logging his behaviors, noting signs of maturity, territorial swipes, deeper growls, longer naps under the trees. "He's changing," one of the caretakers said. "You need to be careful." Daniel nodded, but his heart resisted. He still saw the cub, still remembered the first hum, the weight of that frail body in his arms, the way Moyo had once leaned against his chest like he was trying to remember what safety felt like. And so Daniel stayed, every morning, every dusk, until the warnings became whispers, and the whispers became decisions. "We found a place for him," the director finally told him. "A true sanctuary, acres to roam, other lions. It's time." Daniel didn't answer right away. He just looked at Moyo, who was stretched out in the sun, blinking slowly, tail flicking against the dust. "Can I go with him?" he asked. The director hesitated. "No, it's across the continent, and he'll need time to adjust, to forget." To forget. That word hit harder than any roar ever could. The next morning, the ritual continued. Moyo at the gate. Daniel with meat in one hand and guilt in the other. He sat beside his friend, stroking his mane, already starting to grow, already promising the lion he would one day become. And for the first time, Daniel whispered something different. "Soon," he said, "you'll be free. You'll be where you belong." Moyo looked at him, and for a long moment, nothing moved. Not the wind, not the leaves, not the boy, just a lion's gaze, steady, heavy, ancient. And then gently, Moyo leaned in and rested his head on Daniel's lap. That morning, there was no running, no play, just stillness. Because sometimes, even before goodbye is spoken, the heart already knows it's coming. The truck came just after dawn, its engine rumbling like distant thunder through the sleepy stillness of the valley. Dust curled beneath its tires, swirling around the sanctuary's entrance like a warning. Daniel was already awake. He hadn't slept. He sat on the bench outside Moyo's enclosure, arms around his knees, eyes fixed on the gate like it might change its mind. Inside the pen, Moyo paced, not frantic, just uncertain, like he felt the change in the air but didn't understand its shape. The handlers came quietly, with gloves and crates and long metal poles they never wanted to use. They moved like men who'd done this before, calm, practiced, resigned. Daniel stood. "Let me be the one," he said. His voice didn't shake, but his hands did. The lead handler gave him a look. "It's safer if we... He won't fight me." They hesitated, then nodded. Daniel stepped into the pen. Moyo stopped pacing and looked at him. The lion's body had nearly doubled in size over the past months. His mane had begun to fill in, a soft, growing halo around his face. His eyes were older now, deeper, but they still held that quiet trust. Daniel approached slowly, crouching in the grass. "Hey," he whispered. "Big day today, huh?" Moyo blinked. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of cloth. The old hoodie he always wore, now cut into a square. He'd kept it close for nights like this. He held it out. Moyo sniffed it, then rubbed his cheek against it, purring deep in his throat. The crate door clanked open behind them. Daniel flinched. Moyo didn't. He just looked at Daniel, eyes steady. It was then, right then, that Daniel realized. Moyo knew, not the details, not the logistics, but something in him understood that this wasn't just another morning. Daniel took a breath. "I can't go with you," he said softly, "but you're going to be okay. You're going to be with your own kind, wild, free, like you were meant to be." The handlers stepped forward. Moyo tensed, not in fear, but in instinct. Daniel put a hand on his back. "It's okay." Moyo relaxed. One step, then another. Daniel led him to the crate. No rope, no sedatives, no struggle, just trust. At the edge of the crate, Moyo paused, turned his head, looked at Daniel one last time, and then he stepped inside. The door clanged shut, a sound Daniel would hear in dreams for years. As the truck pulled away, Daniel stood frozen, hands clenched at his sides. He didn't cry. Not then. But as the dust settled and the valley fell silent again, he walked back to Moyo's enclosure and found a single golden hair on the ground. He picked it up, held it in his palm like a relic, and sat down in the grass. The staff gave him space. They always did when it mattered most. He stayed there until the sky turned red and the crickets started to sing. And in that long silence, he whispered the only thing he could. "Don't forget me." The sanctuary was nothing like the old rescue center. It sprawled across hundreds of acres, stitched with rocky outcrops, bone-dry grass, and sun that burned everything golden. There were no fences small enough to feel caged, no humans close enough to feel safe, just wilderness, raw and humming with life. Moyo's arrival didn't make headlines. It didn't need to. To the other lions, he was just another heartbeat in the distance, another pair of eyes watching from behind the brush, another roar blending into the dusk. But Moyo didn't roar, not at first. He wandered alone those first weeks, keeping his distance from the older males. He didn't approach the pride's edge. He didn't fight for food. He didn't even chase the birds that landed nearby, as if some part of him had gone quiet. "He's adjusting," the staff said. "Give him time," the biologists added. But time didn't soften him. If anything, it made his stillness sharper. They watched him from a distance, the young lion who refused to claim space, refused to roar, refused to forget whatever world he'd come from. One night, under a sky bruised with stars, a storm rolled over the hills. Rain pelted the dry ground. Wind shook the trees. And from somewhere deep in the valley, a lion roared, loud, fierce, ancient. It wasn't Moyo. The next morning, the staff found him pacing again, the same slow circles near the edge of the reserve, as if searching for something just out of reach. He'd sit for hours facing north, toward a stretch of land that held nothing but dust and old silence. No one understood why. But in that direction, hundreds of miles away, in a town with cracked sidewalks and a rusting sanctuary gate, a boy was staring out his window. Daniel had changed too. He was taller now, leaner, quieter. His room was still cluttered with books and old clothes, but one shelf had become a shrine. A photograph of a cub licking his cheek, a worn-out hoodie, a single tuft of golden hair in a glass jar. He didn't visit the rescue center anymore. It was too hard. Instead, he wrote letters to the sanctuary, to the staff, to no one in particular. He asked how Moyo was adjusting, if he'd made friends, if he still hummed in the morning light. Most of the replies were clinical. Healthy. Solitary. No abnormal behavior. But one postcard stood out. He doesn't roar, not like the others. Daniel read that line over and over. He wondered if that meant Moyo had forgotten, if time had done what everyone said it would, if the bond they once shared had faded into the same silence they'd once used to heal. But something deep in Daniel resisted the idea, because when a lion roars, the world listens. And Moyo, he had always spoken in silence. The savannah stretched like a painting left unfinished. Golden grasslands curling into distant hills, brush whispering secrets to the wind. It was a land made for wild things, for lions who knew the hunt, for instincts honed through generations of dust, blood, and thunder. But Moyo didn't move like the others. He watched more than he acted. He listened more than he claimed. While other lions marked trees and bared their teeth in dominance games, Moyo wandered, alone, always toward the same edge of the reserve. The rangers started calling it his border. He'd rise early, before the heat drowned the land, and walk the ridge above the river. He'd pause in the same spots, nose to the wind, eyes scanning the emptiness. Then he'd sit, motionless, as if expecting something to appear on the horizon. A shape, a sound, a ghost. Some thought he was waiting for another lion. Others assumed he was drawn to old instincts, maybe even trauma. But there was no trauma in his gaze, just longing, and the silence. No roars, not one. Even when other males roared nearby, challenging, declaring, demanding, Moyo stayed quiet. His mouth opened once during a sunset patrol, chest rising, head thrown back. But no sound came out. The vet who observed him wrote, "His larynx is fine, it's not physical." But Daniel wouldn't have needed a diagnosis. He would have understood it for what it was, a choice. Because Moyo's first sound had never been a roar. It had been a hum, a whisper, a low breath of trust beside a boy's heartbeat. And maybe, without that heartbeat, he had nothing left to say. Weeks turned into months. One evening, just before the rains were due to return, something changed. A lioness wandered near Moyo's territory. She was older, injured, a limp dragging through her back leg. The other lions had ignored her, but Moyo watched. He followed her from a distance at first, cautious. When she lay down beneath a tree, exhausted, he approached. No growl, no threat. He lay down near her, leaving space between them. Over the next days, they shared that shade, never touching, never fighting, just breathing in the same rhythm. The staff noticed. He's showing social behavior. But what they didn't know was that Moyo had begun humming again, not loudly, not often, just small, vibrating notes when the wind was still and the lioness was near. It wasn't a roar, it was something older. One night, the lioness let out a sharp warning growl. Poachers had been spotted near the reserve. Traps were being found along the river. The sanctuary prepared for lockdown. And that morning, when Moyo reached the border, he didn't sit. He paced, agitated, muscles tight, tail lashing. He stared north, toward nothing. But something was coming. Not a sound, a name, a memory, a voice from a world he thought he'd forgotten. Here we go. The letter was wrinkled, sun-stained, and smelled faintly of old paper and eucalyptus, the kind of scent that clings to something important. Daniel found it on a Thursday, buried beneath a week's worth of unopened mail. He almost tossed it, mistaking it for another brochure or bill until he saw the return address. Makulu Wildlife Sanctuary, Northern Reserve Division. His breath caught. He hadn't heard from them in months. The last update had been generic. No major changes. Animal in good health. He'd stopped expecting anything more. People moved on. Animals did too. That's what everyone said. But this envelope felt different. He slid his finger under the seal, slow, cautious, like the paper might disappear if he moved too fast. Inside, a single page, handwritten. Dear Daniel, I hope this finds you well. You should know, Moyo hasn't integrated with the main pride. He avoids conflict, eats separately, and still doesn't vocalize. But recently, he's formed a bond with an injured lioness. We've never seen him this engaged. He hums when she's near. And there's more. Each morning, just before sunrise, he walks to the northern ridge, always the same path, same time. We've tracked his pacing for weeks. He's calm, but focused, like he's waiting. There's something in his behavior we can't explain. Some longing. We thought you should know. If you're ever near the region again, we'd be willing to grant you special access for a supervised visit. Let us know. Regards, Dr. Isa Mbatha, Wildlife Behavior Division. Daniel sat on his bed, the letter trembling in his hand. He read it again and again, and with every word, something uncoiled inside him. A memory, a hunger, a sound he hadn't heard in years, but still echoed beneath his skin. He stood, walked to his bookshelf, and picked up the jar with the single golden tuft of fur, held it to the light. His heart whispered something he'd buried long ago. Go. Within 3 days, his flight was booked. He didn't tell many people. His mother, of course. A few close friends. Most of them didn't understand. It's been years, they said. He's just an animal now. But Daniel didn't hear them, because in a far corner of a wild, open land, a lion had remembered something no one else could explain, and Daniel wasn't going to let him wait any longer. The sun was already high when Daniel stepped off the jeep, boots hitting the dusty red earth with a dull thud. The wind carried the dry scent of acacia bark and old stone, a smell he didn't know he remembered until it hit him, and his eyes stung without warning. Ahead of him stood a tall wire gate reinforced with steel. Beyond it, the reserve stretched endlessly, wild, sun-soaked, untamed. A man leaned against the gatepost, tall, lean, face carved by years of heat and wind. He wore a ranger's badge, a wide-brimmed hat, and the kind of stare that came from seeing too much. "You Daniel?" Daniel nodded. "Yes, sir." The man didn't shake his hand. He just squinted against the sun and said, "You're here for the lion." It wasn't a question. Daniel swallowed. "Yes. Moyo." The ranger nodded, then motioned him toward a shaded bench near the entrance. He sat across from Daniel, elbows on knees, and spoke with the slow weight of someone who had rehearsed this many times before. "Look," he began, "I'm going to tell you what no one else wants to say out loud." Daniel's heart knocked once against his ribs. "It's been years. He was young when you left. That kind of bond, it doesn't always survive time, or distance, or instinct. He's not a cub anymore. He's not tame. He's not safe." Daniel held his gaze. "I know." The ranger studied him, then sighed and looked out across the savannah. "I've seen animals forget," he said. "Seen them walk past their old humans like they were ghosts. Seen them lash out. Seen worse." Daniel stayed quiet. The ranger looked back at him, softer now. "You came all this way. I respect that. But don't expect a miracle. He may not remember you. And if he does, it might not be the way you hope." A long silence passed between them. Then Daniel stood. "I'm not here for a miracle," he said. "I just want to see him." The ranger gave a slow nod, then turned toward the gate. "All right then, we'll go slow. From a distance first. If anything feels wrong, we pull back. Understood?" "Understood." As the gate clanked open, Daniel stepped forward, into heat, into wind, into memory. The land felt ancient, every breeze laced with echoes. Birds called overhead. Distant growls rippled through the grasslands like thunder waiting its turn. Daniel's breath came shallow. Somewhere out there, a lion walked the same trail every morning. A lion who once leaned into his chest like it was the safest place in the world. Now they would see if time had changed everything, or nothing at all. They saw him before he saw them. Moyo stood at the crest of the hill, silhouetted by the harsh noon light, his golden mane rippling slightly in the wind. He was larger than Daniel remembered, majestic, fully grown, powerful in a way that made the earth seem smaller around him. But it was his stillness that struck Daniel most. The lion wasn't hunting. He wasn't moving. He was simply there, facing north, as if listening to something just beneath the surface of the wind. His body looked carved from sun and shadow, his head tilted just enough to suggest awareness without motion. Daniel froze. His breath caught, and every noise around him dimmed. The buzzing flies, the crunch of ranger boots on gravel, even the distant chirrups of birds high in the trees. There he is, he thought, my boy. But this wasn't the cub that had once slept curled at his side. This was a lion, a predator, a king. The ranger raised binoculars but kept his voice low. "We'll stop here. Let him notice us on his own terms." Daniel didn't speak. His throat was too tight. He took a step forward, slowly, pressing one foot into the grass. It bent beneath his weight, silent. Another step, then another. Moyo's ears flicked. His head turned slightly. Not all the way, just enough. Then, his eyes found them. Daniel stopped breathing. Moyo didn't move, didn't blink. The distance between them was only a few dozen meters, but it felt like miles, years, memories, entire lifetimes packed into the space between a man and a lion. They stared at each other, and in that stillness, the world held its breath. Moyo's muscles tightened subtly, like a spring winding. His eyes narrowed, not in aggression, not in fear, but in calculation, recognition. Daniel didn't know. He took a step closer, then another, and another, until he was standing just beyond the perimeter marked for safety. The ranger's voice came sharp behind him. "Daniel, stop!" But Daniel didn't. He raised his hand, slow, palm open, and whispered the only name that mattered. "Moyo." The lion blinked. For a second, nothing happened. And then, his tail flicked. Not fast, not startled, just once. Daniel lowered his hand. Moyo's head tilted slightly, ears angling forward. Then, without warning, he took a single step forward. The ranger tensed, hand brushing the tranquilizer strap on his vest. Moyo took another step. Still no growl, no charge, just movement. Slow, certain, like the tide creeping toward the shore. Daniel stood motionless, heart pounding. 5 steps. 10. The lion was close now. Close enough for Daniel to see the scar above his right eye, a faint mark from the old enclosure gate years ago. Close enough to hear the soft exhale from his nose. Moyo stopped. They were just a few feet apart now. And then, he sat. Simply lowered his massive body into the grass, eyes locked onto Daniel's, tail curling gently behind him. The ranger exhaled, long and shaky. Daniel didn't speak. He didn't dare. He just crouched slowly, meeting Moyo's gaze at eye level, and did the only thing that felt true. He smiled. And in that sacred silence, heavy with years, with questions, with unspoken hope, the lion didn't roar. He just looked, like he was seeing something that didn't belong to this wild world, but to a memory he hadn't let go of. For 5 full minutes, they didn't move. Not the lion, not the man, not even the wind. The entire savannah seemed to pause, as if holding its breath around this moment, unwilling to disturb the fragile thread of memory stretched between predator and boy. Daniel's knees ached from crouching, but he didn't shift. Moyo's gaze held him fast, not blank, not wild, but focused, measured, like he was sifting through years of fog and scent to make sense of the figure in front of him. Then, gently, Moyo rose. One paw at a time, with that silent elegance only lions carry, he walked in a slow arc around Daniel. His body was massive now, his shoulders rising and falling like waves, each step pressing power into the earth. But there was no threat in him, only a kind of sacred caution. Daniel turned, keeping his eyes on Moyo, never flinching. A soft grunt escaped the lion's chest, not a growl, not a warning. More like curiosity, recognition maybe. And then came the sound, a low, pulsing hum, deep, almost imperceptible, like the vibration of a cello string struck gently in a still room. Daniel's chest tightened. He remembered that sound, the very first sound Moyo had made as a cub, curled against his ribs in the back of a rescue van. It wasn't just a hum, it was a memory with breath. The ranger behind him whispered, "He's communicating." Daniel didn't answer. His throat was too full of something ancient and aching. Moyo moved closer, so close now that Daniel could feel the heat of him, the weight of his breath, the faint scent of grass and earth and sun-warmed fur. But just as Daniel reached a hand forward, slow, trembling, open, something cracked through the air. A whip of wind, a cry overhead, a sudden shift. In the distance, a startled bird took flight from the trees. Moyo flinched. His head snapped toward the sound. His ears flattened, his tail stiffened, his muscles tensed in a ripple of instinct. The ranger raised his tranquilizer, shouting, "Move back!" Daniel didn't move. He locked eyes with Moyo again, held his ground. "Easy," he whispered. "It's okay." But something had changed, not in Moyo's trust, but in the air itself. The moment was on the edge now, fragile, teetering between reunion and rupture. And in that precarious stillness, Moyo's mouth opened, not to bite, not to growl, but to roar. A full, thunderous, magnificent roar, the kind that splits the sky and vibrates the soul. Daniel staggered back, stunned. But the roar wasn't for him. It wasn't rage, it was release. It was every quiet year of waiting, every silent morning spent staring north, every hum swallowed by distance. It was Moyo remembering who he was, and who had once loved him. And when the roar faded into the air, echoing across the valley like a storm breaking, Moyo turned and began to walk toward him. He didn't run, not at first. Moyo moved slowly, one heavy paw, then another, eyes fixed on Daniel, who stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, dust curling around his boots. The ranger shouted again, "Daniel, step back! He's charging!" But Daniel didn't move, because this wasn't a charge, not yet. It was something building, like pressure under the earth before an earthquake, a swell in the wind, a hush before the sky breaks open. And then Moyo's pace changed, from walk to trot, from trot to thunder. The ground began to shake beneath Daniel's feet. The lion was coming at him, full force, full speed, a blur of gold and muscle and history unleashed. His eyes locked on Daniel's, unblinking, wild. Daniel's heart stopped. He didn't breathe. This was it. This was where instinct would win. Where nature would reclaim what time had softened. Where a lion's love, if it had ever been real, would be swallowed by the animal he had become. The ranger's weapon clicked behind him. "Daniel, down!" But Daniel didn't flinch, didn't raise a hand, didn't run. He whispered instead, "Moyo." It was the same voice, the same tone, the same boy who once sat in the dirt with a milk bottle and a cub on his lap. And in the final few feet, just before claws would have scraped his chest, before the weight of 400 pounds could have crushed him, Moyo did something impossible. He stopped, skidded, and leaned right into him. All that power, all that momentum, redirected not into violence, but into surrender. Moyo pressed his massive head into Daniel's chest, like he'd done all those years ago. No roar, no sound, just pressure, weight, memory. Daniel crumpled to his knees, arms around the lion's neck, eyes wide with disbelief. The ranger lowered the tranquilizer, lips parted, speechless. Moyo didn't move. He just stayed there, pressed into Daniel, chest rising and falling in time with the man's shallow breath, tail twitching like a metronome marking something holy. It wasn't a hug. It was older than that, bigger than that. It was reunion. And every cell in Daniel's body knew. He remembers. No one moved. Not the ranger, not the lion, not the man who knelt with his arms wrapped around the animal that could kill him in a breath, and chose instead to lean closer. Moyo was still, terrifyingly still, in that way only apex predators can be. But his weight pressed into Daniel like gravity rediscovered, like home. Daniel's fingers sank into the thick fur of his mane. It was coarser now, streaked with dust and wildness, but still familiar, still his. He didn't speak. Words would have shattered the moment, and this silence was sacred. Moyo closed his eyes, and then, slowly, carefully, he dropped his full body into Daniel's lap. The ground shook. The ranger muttered under his breath, half in awe, half in disbelief. "I've never seen anything like this." Daniel didn't answer. He was crying now, not loudly, but the kind of crying that happens when something deep, long buried, breaks open. When every goodbye you never got to finish turns into a whisper pressed into fur. He pressed his forehead to Moyo's, breathing in the wild scent of him. Sweat, dust, earth, sun. It wasn't the scent of a rescue center anymore. It was the scent of Africa, of freedom, of time that had passed and yet somehow not passed at all. "I missed you," he whispered. Moyo let out a deep, satisfied breath, a sound like wind through ancient trees. Then, with an almost human tenderness, he lifted his massive paw and placed it over Daniel's arm. It was not possessive. It was a touch, a hello, a "you're still mine." Behind them, the staff began to gather, silent, reverent, some holding their phones, too stunned to hit record. One young volunteer wiped her eyes. Another mouthed, "Is this real?" But to Daniel, it was never in question. This was real. This was the hug that had waited years to happen. A hug that didn't belong to zoos or cages or science journals. It belonged to a boy who once sat with a frightened cub in a forgotten corner of the world and gave him a name that meant heart. And now, that heart had found its way back. After what felt like hours, Moyo stood, slowly, reluctantly, and shook the dust from his coat. He circled Daniel once, brushing against his shoulder, and let out a soft chuff. Then he turned his gaze to the horizon, back to the wild, back to the life he had made on his own, and Daniel understood. This was not a return. It was a reunion, a reminder. I remember you, but I am not yours anymore. And Daniel didn't need him to be. He smiled, wiped his tears, and whispered, "Go on, boy. I'm okay." Moyo stood still for one last second, one breath, and then padded away, tail flicking behind him like a comma in a story that wasn't finished, just paused. The video was never supposed to go viral. One of the volunteers, hands trembling, had recorded it from behind the fence, just a few minutes of shaky footage. A man, a lion, and something no one could quite name. No tricks, no cages, no violence, just a moment. But within 24 hours, it was everywhere. Man reunites with lion after years apart. You won't believe what happens. Real-life Lion King moment captivates millions. A hug that took a decade. The clips flooded social media, the lion charging, the hug, the weight of a head pressed against a man's chest. No one could watch without feeling something rise in their throat. The comments poured in by the thousands. "I've never cried at a lion video before. This is what love looks like. I didn't know animals could remember like that. This is proof of something bigger than science." Scientists debated it. Behaviorists analyzed every frame. Some called it imprinting, others called it a fluke. But none of the explanations mattered, because people weren't watching for facts. They were watching for faith. Faith that the bonds we form don't disappear, that love doesn't dissolve just because years pass, that even wild hearts can remember the sound of someone who once whispered, "You're safe." Daniel didn't say much to the press. He didn't do the morning shows or the interviews. He let the footage speak for itself. When asked by a reporter what he felt in that moment, he simply said, "He knew me. That was enough." The sanctuary became a pilgrimage spot, not for tourists, they wouldn't allow that, but for students, wildlife workers, people who had once lost something and wanted to believe it might find them again. They left notes on the gate. "For my father, I hope you remember me too. To the dog I lost when I was 7, I still dream of you." This story saved me. Thank you, Moyo. The sanctuary staff, hardened by years of difficult rescues and quiet losses, began to change too. Their reports grew softer. They smiled more. Some even left early to go home to their own animals and hold them a little longer. But no one changed more than Daniel. He went back home, but not empty. He didn't speak of Moyo often, but sometimes, when the house was quiet, he'd pull out the old hoodie and press his fingers to the worn fabric, the same one the cub had once slept against. And in that quiet, he'd hear it again, that hum, low, soft, a sound that once meant fear. Now, it meant memory. It meant love that never needed to raise its voice. They didn't live in the same world anymore. Moyo had his territory now, vast, sun-scorched, ruled by instinct and silence. He roamed the hills at dusk, slept beneath acacia trees, and watched the stars without needing anyone beside him. But every few weeks, just after sunrise, he would appear at the ridge. Always the same path, always the same stillness, as if time itself had folded to make room for this ritual. And Daniel would be there too. Not inside the enclosure, not anymore. The sanctuary had rules, and Moyo had changed. His wildness was no longer just physical. It was his right, his identity. But Daniel didn't need to touch him to feel close. He would sit on the observation deck a few meters above the plane, legs dangling, elbows on his knees, watching the lion approach like a prayer answered without a word. Sometimes Moyo would lie down just beneath the deck, resting in the shade of the man he once knew as a boy. Other times he'd sit facing north, the wind stirring his mane, eyes half closed, the same way he had years ago, before Daniel ever returned. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. One morning, Daniel brought a notebook. He didn't write poetry or stories, just simple things. You like the mornings best. You walk the same way every time. You used to sleep on my chest. He tore the pages out, folded them, and placed them under a flat stone at the base of the platform. He never knew if anyone read them, but it felt right to leave something behind. Moyo never stayed long. After a while, he would rise, stretch, and vanish back into the brush, tail flicking like a closing sentence. Daniel would watch until the lion was just a shimmer in the heat. Then he'd stand, tuck the notebook into his bag, and walk back down the dusty path, heart full. There was a new rhythm now, a balance. They were together again, not as boy and cub, not as keeper and rescued, but as two beings who had shared something the world still didn't quite understand. And that was enough. The sanctuary offered Daniel a part-time role. He accepted. He didn't need to be close to Moyo every day. He just needed to be near enough to know. He's there. He's safe. He remembers. And sometimes that's what love becomes. Not closeness, not possession, just presence, even from afar. Every Sunday, just before noon, the lion would come. The staff didn't announce it anymore. They didn't need to. It had become a rhythm older than memory, older than habit, a silent appointment held between two souls who had long since stopped needing reminders. Moyo would appear from the southern edge, his paws silent on the cracked red earth, his mane dusted with leaves and sun. He didn't roar. He didn't stalk. He simply walked the path he had carved into the land with time and patience and memory. The same trail, the same ridge, the same gate. And there, waiting, was Daniel. He never arrived early, never stayed late. He'd sit on the low wooden bench just beyond the barrier, hands in his lap, eyes scanning the horizon. And then the shape would emerge, golden, slow, certain. Moyo would come to the gate and pause. Their eyes would meet. And for a moment, the years would fall away. Sometimes Daniel would speak. Soft things, nothing important. Hey, old friend. You look stronger. Still keeping them in line out there? And Moyo would hum. Not every time, but enough to know he hadn't forgotten the language they once shared. He'd rest there a while, lying with his front paws crossed, his body stretched along the sun-warmed earth, eyes half-lidded, watching, listening, breathing the same air as the boy, now a man, who once carried him out of a cage and into something better. The sanctuary visitors were never allowed close during these visits. But those who happened to witness it, from afar, through binoculars or behind fences, often left changed. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. The bond didn't roar, it didn't leap, it didn't perform, it waited, it remembered, it stayed. And one Sunday, when the sun hung low and the sky turned to ash blue, Daniel arrived as always. He sat on the bench, waited. But Moyo didn't come. He waited an hour, then two. Still nothing. The ranger approached quietly. He might be farther out today. They sometimes do that. Daniel nodded, but he didn't leave. He stayed until dusk painted the hills gold. And then, just as the wind shifted, he saw him, not walking, not running, just there, at the ridge, watching. Moyo didn't approach this time. He simply stood, silhouetted by the sinking light, tail still, eyes locked onto Daniel's. And then, he bowed his head, slowly, deeply. It was not submission. It was not instinct. It was acknowledgement. I know you're there. I remember. I still wait too. Daniel stood, his throat too full to speak. He didn't cry. He didn't wave. He just smiled and walked away. Because he knew. Some love doesn't live in cages or homes or even in arms. It lives in paths worn by years, in silence shared at a distance, in the quiet loyalty of a lion who still waits by the gate.